In this presentation, I'm going to make the case that unilateral trade policy is where the action has been in trade policy since the global financial crisis. I will start by putting this in context. If I had set the task of saying what is the dominant trade policy dynamic since the fall of the Berlin Wall, I would have to have accepted that you had major regional initiatives like NAFTA, the creation of the WTO. And in fact, if you go back to the 90s and much of the noughties, a lot of the narrative about the trading system focused on multilateral developments and on regional developments. Sadly, since the Doha round didn't work out, we've seen a lot less action at the multilateral level, but there are some good points to highlight in the agreement on trade facilitation and the recent agreement on fishery subsidies. And of course, if you were really to do a comprehensive job looking at trade policy dynamics at the multilateral level, you would also have to credit the multilateral institutions with shaping the accession of many countries to the world trading system. So this would be an area there. But if you look since the global financial crisis, we don't really have too much to show at the multilateral level. Government's attention shifted in the last decade or so to regional trade deals, a lot of interest in mega regional trade deals, two of which didn't really work out. The TPP was signed and then the United States withdrew. The Trans-Pacific Partnership didn't work. We did, however, get some other regional initiatives through CPP, RCEP, and the African deal. These are all step forwards, but there was a marked slowdown in the number of RTAs, regional trading agreements that were signed, and this comes through very clearly in the WTO data. But one bright spot, or one of the bright spots of in cooperation between small numbers of countries, has been in the digital area. The digital economy partnership agreements at GI, I think, are a very interesting area which is developing and may well become a source of multilateral initiatives later. But if you look back over the last decade or so, you can't really point to reciprocity, that is doing deals, as generating much in terms of market opening. Now, if you read a lot of the literature, the academic literature, the published literature, you wouldn't get this impression at all. Doctoral students studying the WTO are still studying models of why multilateral trade cooperation happens when in fact it hasn't been happening. And so if anything, where the wrong stylized fact is being addressed in a lot of research. And as I said, the regional imperatives have dwindled. So instead, what have we had? Well, we do have some analysis of unilateral measures, but mainly very salient unilateral measures like the US-China trade war. This is clear, and the disruption to supply chains that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. And these have been where research has tended to focus. What research has tended to overlook are the more hidden, less transparent forms of trade distortion which are out there. I think there are very good reasons why we have tended as a profession to overlook these very important areas. Now, I don't want to suggest that non-tariff barriers are something new. I mean, Richard Baldwin's dad wrote a whole book about this in 1970. So we're all aware that they exist, but what we just don't have is very good data on this. And actually, it's worth reflecting why. The answer is very heavily incentive driven. The first is policymakers have a very strong incentive to use less transparent, harder to identify trade policy instruments. This has been well established in the economics and political science literature, and I'll show you some consequences of that later. Secondly, many governments have failed to disclose their non-tariff policies to the WTO. The WTO Secretariat, to its credit, is on record calling out G20 countries for not reporting much of their subsidies in the past decade or so. And so it's not as if the data is being supplied to the one organization which should be collecting it. Third, if the WTO doesn't get the data given it to them, they could collect it themselves. But here, I mean, if you put yourself in the shoes of a senior WTO official collecting lots of data on your major shareholders, the governments, you can imagine the pressure that's going to be put on you. So there, I think there's a bit of natural self-restraint. And as for academics collecting data, forget it. We like downloading data. We don't like collecting it, right? So you're not going to find much data collected on non-tariff barriers there. Why do you hear less discussion about these matters from amongst policymakers? there are a strong number of very supportive officials who want to see the multilateral trading system exist. They know very well the trade distortions that I'm about to show you later are important, but they don't want to criticize the system for just in case it's seen as encouraging the critics of globalization. And the last and perhaps very cynical reason is, as I'll show you, lots of countries have been engaging in these less transparent trade distortions, and something of a glass house syndrome has emerged, which is the old saying, people who live in glass houses don't throw stones. And once it became apparent that lots of countries were engaging, lots of the big players were engaging in trade distortions, and I'll show you the data in a minute, then I think we ended up not with peer review at the WTO, we ended up with peer protection. And so many countries pulled their punches. So for all of these reasons, I think it's very good reasons why we don't have the data and we don't have much discussion on unilateral trade policy beyond the trade war and the initial response to the pandemic. And so what I have sought to do over the last few years, last 12 years, I should say, is to assemble essentially a machinery and a team which is systematically collecting this information on the traditional salient trade policies like tariffs, quotas, and alike, and then the less salient ones like local content requirements, Buy America requirements, the subsidies that people were talking about earlier, and putting together essentially a very large data set, which is now publicly available and has been used in almost 3,000 studies now. So this data set is what I want to essentially draw upon. But let's start with the more salient public policy responses, because I think some of them are, this will confirm what I think some of you have intuited, and certainly what Anne and Annabelle have alluded to. In the area of medical goods, if you go back to the beginning of 2020, you can see in terms of the more salient trade policy interventions, we see a huge number of countries liberalizing trade in imports of these goods. And this is very sensible policy. Why would you want to tax soap when everyone should be washing their hands? This chart on the left shows you the total number of import reforms in effect each week since the beginning of 2020. So we did have a large number of import reforms. We also had very early on in 2020, a surge in the number of export curbs and controls on medical goods. And these did get a huge amount of attention because they disrupted supply chains. And of course, many of us pushed back against these measures, saying that they were preventing trade from helping solve or at least contribute towards the solution to the medical consequences of COVID-19. What is much less appreciated is that over time, we've also seen a steady drum roll and increase in the number of import restrictions on medical goods. And there's actually been a surge of them this year, which has picked up over time. And the number of countries which have imposed import restrictions, as the right-hand chart shows, has increased about a third this year. So there's some bad news as well. But you can see unilateral policy was, I think, very central to the story at the beginning of the pandemic and quite frankly, since the invasion of Ukraine as well. If you turn to food and agri-food, much more of a muted response, unilateral trade policy responses at the beginning of the pandemic. And this was often put down to the fact that we had very good monitoring of these policies, but we still saw a number of trade export curbs put in place. But this pales into insignificance compared to the developments at the beginning of this year, since the beginning of this year, where we have a large number of export curbs which have been put in place and are well documented in the media. And but I should also add, it's very important to say we've had a large number of import reforms too, as many countries have sensibly cut tariffs on as world food prices increase. And so what we have then is quite important unilateral policy responses which have been the subject of analysis, and what I'm showing you here probably confirms what you may have read or intuited from the newspapers. So definitely salient trade policy is part of the story, and I wouldn't want to deny it. What I would like to highlight, however, is that since the global financial crisis began, when we started collecting data from November 2008, we have assembled information on over 45,000 policy changes around the world. And what we can do for the for the policy interventions affecting trade in goods is to tag them with the goods that they are traded in at the most granular level possible using global trade statistics, and then add up what's the amount of trade that's covered by trade reforms and by trade restrictions. And you can do this for both transparent policy interventions, but also the non-transparent ones as well. And there's a very interesting pattern which may go some way to help understand the literature which has been written on the post-global financial crisis and trade policy. That literature basically makes the point that transparent trade policy wasn't really a problem. And by and large, our results confirm that. If you look on this slide here, the dotted green and the dotted red lines show the share of global world trade that is covered by trade reforms in green and trade restrictions in red. So these trade restrictions would be tariff increases and the like. And you can see that once the global financial crisis hit, the share of trade covered by new trade restrictions, which is what this chart shows, is very small. Okay, and over time, the green dotted line is always above the red dotted line. So fair enough, we didn't have the 1930s response to the global financial crisis, and I suppose that's good. What that story misses and what the literature misses is that there's a lot of non-transparent policy, which was also introduced after the global financial crisis started, and that non-transparent trade policy, at least the trade distortions associated with them, covered much more trade than the trade reforms. And so if you then look at all trade measures which distort or harm trade, that is the solid red line here, you can see in 2009 about 40% of world trade was covered by some type of trade distortion, which wasn't there before the financial crisis hit. Whereas about 5 or 6% of world trade was covered by trade reforms, which had been put in place in 2009, but not earlier. And so you can see this gap increases over time, and the cumulative effect of all the measures which are in force takes you to a situation now where over 80% of world goods trade is covered by some type of trade distortion. By the way, this chart, as measures lapse or are phased out, they do not count towards the subsequent annual total. So this only takes account of policy interventions which are in effect. So what we learned from this is that tracking transparent trade policies only is deeply misleading. This was only possible precisely because we collected this information on non-transparent trade policy. Now, you might be asking, well, what are these non-transparent trade policies? Well, we can extract by classes of trade policy instrument what shares of world trade are associated with different types of non-tariff measure. And this chart shows you the main headline findings. We have, just as a benchmark, the transparent trade measures in black. What we see is subsidies to local firms growing as a trade distortion. We have, by the time we get to the early 20s, over 30, nearly 40% of world trade covered by subsidies to local firms. Subsidies to exporters and export incentives are an even larger problem. And then if you combine them, you can get the overall figure. Bear in mind that there will be some product overlap between the two subsidy categories. Let me say a couple of observations here before moving on. First, notice then that the key 2009 policy response to the global financial crisis was not to raise tariffs like the 1930s, but to actually offer subsidies. And in these cases, these are only subsidies to manufacturing firms or firms which produce goods. All the banking finance subsidies are not included in any of this. None of the Kurzarbeit subsidies for labor are included. This is all selective subsidization of firms. So the unilateral trade distortion that was most prevalent in the global financial crisis was on the subsidy side. Second observation to make here is that you may have heard Donald Trump complaining about how subsidies were distorting more and more of global trade, and he picked on US trading partners who he thought were doing this. And the answer is yes, there was evidence of this. But we often as a profession chose to ignore it because anything that Donald Trump said couldn't possibly be right. Okay. Third comment to make is that these two types of subsidies work in different ways. The subsidies to local firms may well have substituted for some imports and reduced trade, but the subsidies, the export incentives, should have increased trade. Now think about the presentation that Richard Baldwin gave earlier, where he showed the goods trade has faltered in its growth for, or at least compared to world GDP in recent years. I think the interesting question I would ask is, how much slower would a world goods trade have been in the absence of these export incentives? Another comment I would make is that Richard identified the growing export shares of the I6 countries. It is the very I6 countries that have offered these export incentives. So that might help you put the story together. And to our macro colleagues, much is often written about how globalization, China's integration in the world economy helped pull down prices over the last decades or so. One question you might want to ask since the global financial crisis is how much of the subsidies which have been pumped into the trading system have helped pull down prices too. So that might be a factor, and it's often a factor. I have not seen anyone connect the subsidy policy intervention data to the price changes at the aggregate level. So there may be some interesting ties to other presentations and observations which have been made earlier today.
Simon, with apologies, can I suggest 2 more minutes to conclude?
I will be done in 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Don't worry. You will probably be wanting to know how do countries vary across the G20? Well, this is if you took yesterday's policies which are in effect, these are the shares of national imports which are covered by different countries' trade distortion. So these are both the transparent import restrictions as well as the subsidies. We have some countries which are very, very have a lot of market access at risk. India, Indonesia, this will not surprise anyone. It may surprise you that if you add all this stuff up, China and the United States are barely indistinguishable in terms of their policy stance towards imports. And before one credits Japan, Mexico, and South Korea, all three countries are very good at hiding subsidies. So that's still there's still a work in progress there. So there's interesting variation across countries as well. Last point, I will not dwell on it much. Although we've talked a lot about trade in goods, some people earlier talked about trade in services and digital trade. We track in the digital policy alert the interventions which are affecting the digital sector, many of which are subject to cross-border competition. There has been a huge surge in unilateral action there, and a lot of that action is still in the pipeline. So that's, if you want to add to the unilateral picture, that's an important factor. Let me just look forward and draw out some questions which I think follow from this. We are seeing states being more active for all sorts of reasons, like dealing with climate change, narrowing the digital divide, et cetera, et cetera. I think a fundamental question is, does a more active state have to have a more discriminatory trade policy? What restraints are feasible on state action as governments act in a more activist way, dealing with all of these different challenges? And if that weren't enough, one layers on top of it the geopolitical rivalry, which has already been mentioned by others, and one can see just how much the pressure on unilateral trade policy will, I think, intensify. Thank you for your time.